Thank you.
We turn now to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, an international watchdog organization created to oversee the elimination of chemical weapons. Earlier this year, we learned from multiple whistleblowers at this organization that the impartiality of the OPCW had been compromised, as it hid evidence to suggest the staging of the 2018 chemical attack in Douma, Syria, an attack that paved the way for further military action against the country, including a bombing campaign featuring over 100 of Raytheon's Tomahawk missiles. Now, even when WikiLeaks began releasing OPCW documents backing up these claims of these whistleblowers, most of the corporate-owned media outlets refused to touch these revelations, causing at least one journalist at Newsweek to resign earlier this month. In his resignation letter, he wrote, quote, "It's a shame you will be losing a talented journalist who actually cares about important reporting and who was excited to work here because you value protecting U.S. interests more. Because of behavior like this, more and more people will continue to turn away from places like Newsweek because you treat audiences like idiots and withhold from them provable facts that they can easily find elsewhere." Joining me now is Tarek Haddad, the UK-based journalist in question. Thanks for coming on, Tarek. If you could first give us a brief timeline of what went down between you and Newsweek's editors in your effort to publish this news about the OPCW whistleblowers.
Sure. Thank you for having me on. So it started roughly in mid-November. I started to cover the Syria, kind of the Turkish invasion into Syria after the US announced that they were withdrawing troops. A week into the attack, Turkey was accused of using white phosphorus, so I reported on this as I normally would. I did a follow-up story about why white phosphorus continues to be used and the kind of chemical weapons conventions around that. So it was when I was doing that story, I started to become aware of other kind of things that were happening at the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. I started to hear about whistleblowers and leaks, but it was still, kind of tangential evidence at that time, but more and more evidence was building, and then it got to 25th of November, and then a journalist here in the UK by the name of Peter Hitchens for the Mail on Sunday, he wrote a piece with a leaked letter with one of the OPCW scientists, and this letter is now available via WikiLeaks. I tried to report this, and I approached my editors to say, this is an important story, we should be reporting it. And that was the moment it was declined.
Now, after it was,
I don't know if, what kind of more contact. Mm-hmm.
Now, after it was declined, did you go back and forth with them a little bit? And what kind of reasons did they give you for not putting this out?
Sure. I think this touches on a very kind of troubling trend in the media at the moment, is that it was my efforts to, or my intelligence or my abilities as a reporter were kind of ignored, and I was just referred to a Bellingcat article that addressed these leaks. What a lot of people might not know about Bellingcat is that they're funded by places like the Atlantic Council, or they have deep connections with the Atlantic Council and places like the National Endowment for Democracy, essentially think tanks and US State Department funded agencies and things of that nature. So they are essentially a propaganda arm, and now there is clear evidence to say this.
Right.
So I had a problem with that in the first. I had a problem with that because I'm aware of this background. So for me, that's a conflict of interest, and I also was capable of going through the evidence by myself. I took apart that Bellingcat article. I refuted the points that were raised, and when I did this, the editors still were not willing to run the story. So it shows this kind of trend in the media at the moment where editors are relying on Bellingcat, even though there is evidence to say that they're not a journalistic enterprise; they are government propaganda.
Right, and for our audience members who may not know, the Atlantic Council takes money from NATO. The National Endowment for Democracy was created to do the CIA's work overtly. Now, I want to turn to the Council on Foreign Relations. We have a man named Dimi Ryder, who's Newsweek's international affairs editor, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, who you've written about in the recent past. Do you have any firsthand knowledge of the CFR's influence on Newsweek's international affairs reporting?
Sure. Just to be clear with Dimi Ryder, he was at the European Council of Foreign Relations, but it's the sister think tank. So, I mean, he was, he's still listed as I believe a fellow at that organization. And this is, I'm not aware of other individuals, but kind of once I started to investigate this, I realized that this was a trend among many media organizations. And then most famously, there was Fareed Zakaria, who will be very well known to US audiences. He was the editor at Newsweek for 10 years. Prior to Newsweek, he was the editor of Foreign Affairs, which is the Council on Foreign Relations' own publication. Throughout the Iraq War, he was one of the biggest cheerleaders. As early as 2001, he was writing articles, saying why the US should go to war with Iraq. Numerous articles of that nature. Interestingly, Foreign Affairs, that publication at the time of the Iraq War, just to show you how influential the Council on Foreign Relations is, it won, it was ranked the first place in this survey of, how it influences public opinion and how it influences politicians. So we clearly have this organization that's pushing essentially fake narratives out, and it has a deeply, deep effect on the public opinion.
In the final 30 seconds here, I want to ask you that given you've been questioning some of these official narratives, specifically here with the OPCW scandal, have you experienced any censorship on the major social media platforms?
Yeah, I have actually, funnily enough. And there's evidence of this widespread, not just to me. It seems that Twitter itself is kind of shadow banning certain accounts or certain tweets that are mentioning that OPCW are getting hidden from people's timelines. It's kind of since I've resigned, I have decided to become an independent journalist. I tweeted a few messages just to thank everyone that supported me, listed my Patreon page that's just gone live. And then as soon as this was done, I received numerous tweets that say that these were hidden. So there is definitely censorship going on.
Tariq Haddad, thank you so much for your work, and thanks for coming on. In fact,